Hello, welcome to this video about the worst forms of Child Labour Convention number 182. This convention is the second of the two fundamental ILO conventions on child labour and the first and only convention in ILO history to achieve universal ratification. So why has this convention received such universal and far-reaching support? The answer lies both within the goals of the convention and with its innovative and comprehensive approach to tackling the worst forms of child labour.
Why was Convention number 182 adopted when there was already the Child Labour Convention, Minimum Age Convention 138? Convention 182 was unanimously adopted in 1999. At the time, there was a growing consensus that certain forms of child labor were so fundamentally at odds with children's basic human rights that they must be eliminated as a priority. The adoption of the convention helped to focus the international spotlight on the urgency to eliminate the worst forms of child labor, but it did this without losing the long-term goal of the effective elimination of all child labor as required under Convention 138. The two conventions, therefore, complement one another. While Convention 138 establishes a minimum age, generally of 15, for admission to work or employment, Convention 182 applies to all children under 18 years of age and requires ratifying states to take immediate, effective, and time-bound measures to eliminate the worst forms of child labor as a matter of urgency.
What exactly are the worst forms of child labour? The convention clearly defines what is meant by the worst forms of child labour. These are slavery or practices similar to slavery, such as the sale and trafficking of children, debt bondage, and forced or compulsory labour, which includes the forced recruitment of children for use in armed conflict. The use, procuring, or offering of a child for prostitution or for pornography, the use, procuring, or offering of a child for illicit activities, such as for the production and trafficking of drugs, is also a worst form of child labour. Lastly, hazardous work, which is work that by its nature or the circumstances surrounding the job, which is likely to harm the health, safety, or morals of the child, is also a worst form of child labour. And this can include jobs performed in certain sectors, such as mining or agriculture, as well as certain jobs performed in particularly dangerous circumstances, such as night work. It can also include specific tasks such as carrying heavy loads, working with pesticides, or other hazardous substances. Now, the convention specifies that it is up to the competent authority of each country, in consultation with the social partners, to determine the jobs and tasks that children under 18 years of age are prohibited from performing.
So, what do ILO member states have to do to combat the worst forms of child labor? The root causes that lead children to engage in these worst forms of child labor are usually complex and interconnected and can be social, economic, cultural, religious, political, and more. They accordingly require a multi-pronged response. Convention number 182 is a comprehensive instrument that highlights not only the need for legislative measures to prohibit the engagement of children in the worst forms of child labor, but also the necessity to ensure strong law enforcement mechanisms and to adopt programmatic measures to combat these worst forms in practice. It also highlights the importance of international cooperation in tackling this global issue.
What legislation should countries adopt? We've defined what the worst forms of child labour are, so it is important that these be prohibited by law in each country. This is usually done through various pieces of legislation, labour laws, but also criminal laws, in particular when it comes to penal offences such as the sale and trafficking of children or the use of children in armed conflict, in prostitution or pornography, or in the trafficking of drugs. Now, governments are also required to ensure that their legislation is effectively applied in practice. This means strong monitoring and enforcement mechanisms, including the Labour Inspectorate and law enforcement bodies such as the police, the judiciary, and border patrols. It also means the provision and application of strong and dissuasive penalties, both imprisonment and fines as needed.
What type of plans or programs should countries adopt to combat the worst forms of child labor? The Convention requires member states to adopt national plans of action to combat the worst forms of child labor as a priority. These action plans should be developed in consultation with the social partners and any other concerned stakeholder, such as, for example, civil society organizations. The Convention also requires government to adopt effective and time-bound measures.
First, time-bound measures should aim to prevent children from becoming engaged in the worst forms of child labor. School attendance and completion, for example, has been proven as one of the most effective ways of preventing child labor and its worst forms. This convention really emphasizes the importance of education by requiring that time-bound measures be adopted to ensure access to free basic education for all children. Secondly, time-bound measures should aim to withdraw children who are already engaged in the worst forms of child labor and then rehabilitate and socially reintegrate them. Rehabilitation and social integration can be achieved in various ways, including through the establishment of child protection programs, as well as centers that provide healthcare, accommodation, psychological support, vocational training, and more. Now, Convention 182 also underlines the importance of taking into consideration vulnerable categories of children. By that, we mean that certain groups can be more vulnerable to being pushed into the worst forms of child labor. For example, children living in the streets are at high risk of becoming involved in street begging or being used or recruited into drug trafficking. Moreover, orphans, especially of parents having died from HIV/AIDS, refugee or displaced children, children from certain communities who face discrimination, are all to be taken into consideration in the elaboration of time-bound measures. Finally, the Convention also mentions that time-bound measures should be taken to address the special situation of girls who are often, unfortunately, more vulnerable to becoming engaged in the worst forms of child labor, especially in certain sectors such as domestic work. The gender component is therefore an essential element that needs to be taken into account when developing programs to combat the worst forms of child labor.
Let's move to international cooperation. How does that play a role in combating the worst forms of child labor? A very interesting aspect of the Convention is that it requires governments to assist one another through enhanced international cooperation, including support for social and economic development and poverty eradication programs. By adopting measures to alleviate poverty, providing decent work opportunities, and strengthening social protection systems, we can break the cycle of poverty and mitigate the push factors that lead children from vulnerable households to becoming engaged in the worst forms of child labor. But international cooperation is important also in other ways. Countries can and should work together to prevent and combat the worst forms of child labor because fundamentally they violate children's basic rights. In particular, international cooperation is essential in combating the sale and trafficking of children because of the very nature of this crime, which is hidden and often brings children to cross borders. For instance, countries can help each other by sharing knowledge and resources and conclude agreements to improve law enforcement.
In conclusion, unfortunately, millions of children are still found in the worst forms of child labor across the globe. The fight is far from over, but with the proper implementation of Convention number 182, with its wide variety of measures, we can do better. Now that the Convention has been ratified by all of the ILO's member states, the momentum for a stronger push to combat the worst forms of child labor is here. Hi, and welcome to this video about the Minimum Age Convention number 138, one of the two ILO fundamental conventions on child labor. Now, child labor has been at the heart of ILO concerns since its foundation in 1990. And while great progress has been achieved in eradicating child labor, it remains a persistent problem in the world today. Did you know that according to the latest estimates on child labor of 2020, 160 million children, that is to say 63 million girls and 97 million boys, were in child labor globally at the beginning of 2020, accounting for almost 1 in 10 of all children worldwide? Now, 79 million children, nearly half of all those in child labor, were in hazardous work that directly endangers their health, safety, and moral development. Global progress against child labor has stalled since 2016, and the COVID-19 crisis threatens to worsen the situation unless we take urgent policy action.
So what exactly is child labor? Not all work done by children should be classified as child labor. Children or adolescents' participation in work that doesn't affect their health, safety, and personal development or interfere with their schooling can be positive. Child labor is defined as work that deprives children of their childhood, their potential, and their dignity, and that is harmful to their physical and mental development. It refers to work that is mentally, physically, socially, or morally dangerous and harmful to children, and work that interferes with their schooling.
What approach does Convention 138 envisage? The aim of the convention is simple: the effective abolition of child labor. But child labor is a phenomenon that is caused by several factors: social, economic, cultural, and more. And it's important that action taken takes this reality into consideration to be truly effective. Convention 138 is a comprehensive instrument that highlights the need to properly regulate the minimum age at which children can be allowed to work, and recognizes the importance of national policies to ensure the effective abolition of child labor. That is part of the reason why this convention is one of the ILO's most highly ratified instruments. And that is the reason why so many countries with diverse social and economic conditions have ratified the convention. This speaks not only to the universal values that it underpins, but to the flexibility built into it, which allows countries to adapt its content to meet their needs.
What do ILO member states have to do to combat child labor? In order to combat the underlying root causes of child labor, each ratifying country has to establish a national policy for the elimination of child labor. While the determination of such policies is left to countries, national policies must be elaborated in consultation with the employers and workers' organizations. The minimum age recommendation number 146, which accompanies Convention number 138, provide further guidance by stressing that national policies and plans should provide, for example, for poverty alleviation measures and the promotion of decent work for adults, so that parents do not need to resort to child labor, free and compulsory education and provision of vocational training, the extension of social security schemes, and more.
What does the convention require in terms of minimum age for admission to employment or work? Convention 138 requires countries to establish a minimum age for entry into work or employment, which is generally 15 years. Now, developing countries have the option of setting a minimum age of 14 as a transitional measure as they strengthen their education system and economies. This is one of the convention's many flexible provisions. The objective, however, is to progressively raise the minimum age to 15 or 16. Now, the convention also requires ratifying states to set another important age, that of compulsory education. It provides that this age of compulsory education should be aligned with the minimum age for admission to work. Now, it is a known fact that education is one of the best means of preventing child labor. It is important that children have at least basic education to be prepared for a productive and fulfilling work life. By linking the age for admission to employment or work to the age of completion of compulsory schooling, governments contribute to ensuring that children are not out of school before being legally allowed to enter the labour market. What's more, it encourages children to complete their education rather than leave school to work. Convention 138 also protects older children by setting the minimum age for hazardous work at 18. By hazardous work, we mean work which is likely to jeopardize children's health, safety, or morals. For example, children under 18 should not work in mines, as mining is hazardous by nature. Night work, which interferes with children's sleep and may make them more prone to suffer accidents on the job or expose them to dangerous circumstances on the way to and from their place of work, should also not be admissible to children under 18.
Convention 138 also contains what we call flexibility provisions in recognition of countries' varying levels of development. For example, we said that developing countries have the option of setting the minimum age for employment or work at 14. This is one of the Convention's flexible provisions, but there are others. For example, developing countries can also exclude some branches of economic activity, but not sectors such as mining, construction, and commercial agricultures. Convention 138 also allows countries to permit children from the age of 13 to perform light work. Light work is defined as work that does not interfere with children's schooling or their ability to benefit from it, and that is not harmful. If countries use this flexible provision, they have to develop a list of light work activities in their legislation. Moreover, the convention also allows children of at least 14 years of age to work in apprenticeships, and children below the minimum age can also participate in artistic performances if they have the authorization of the competent national authority.
In conclusion, child labor is a global phenomenon that each and every country must make the effort to combat. While progress has been made, we cannot be complacent. Child labor still widely exists today, and every new crisis creates a risk of more children working in conditions that threaten their health and development. Governments, workers, and employers should all work together to ensure the effective application of Convention number 138 to achieve its objective, the effective elimination of child labor everywhere.